Well before even Sony officially confirmed that the PlayStation 5 would be able to run PS4 games, there were a number of rumours that we would indeed see full backwards compatibility with older PlayStation consoles, some even going as far as to say the handhelds such as the Vita. But yeah, after that, Sony confirmed PS4 backwards compatibility, but yet nothing about PS1 and onwards. And when you think about it, the idea behind this, the thought of it is pretty tantalizing. Imagine having one machine which is capable of playing Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, and just about everything else. It's honestly just incredible, the library of games that have been available on the older PlayStation consoles. But yeah, there would be some logistical issues, for example, the first of which is if you had a digital machine, getting the rights, well, Sony getting the rights anyway, to sell some of those older titles from the PlayStation 3 even on PSN would be, let's say, quite difficult. And yeah, owners of a physical machine wouldn't necessarily have so many obstacles. You could probably just plonk the disc into your console and you're good to go. But that would mean, of course, that people who did own the digital console would certainly have, let's say, some complaints over the situation. So this brings me to the crux of today's video. There's been a lot of excitement online thanks to numerous patents filed by Sony which seem to detail backwards compatibility support which some believe is actually referencing PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. Unfortunately, it's almost certain they are not actually referencing those systems, but instead the method Sony have used for PlayStation 4 support on their newest console. There are a plethora of patents at this point available from Sony detailing many aspects of the PlayStation 5, although not everything of course. But a number of these patents have phrases such as spoofing CPU ID or fine-grained clock frequencies, or controls actually. They have been around for, well, quite a long time, in fact some of them a couple of years or even longer. Essentially, these patents are for the PlayStation 5 when you put a PlayStation 4 game into the system, and the game has not been updated for PlayStation 5 hardware. Now, of course, Sony have released patches for games, such as Final Fantasy VII Remake, God of War, but generally, just about every PlayStation 4 game, whether it's been patched or not, can work on the PS5 system. Without getting too deep into the nitty-gritty of these patents or the methodology that Sony have employed to do this, essentially the PlayStation 5 basically turns off various elements of its GPU, reducing clock frequency, and with the CPU doing similar things, such as disabling SMT or simultaneous multi-threading. The PlayStation 5 CPU is based on Zen 2, and therefore it has SMT, so it can handle 2 threads per core. So rather than having 8 cores, 16 threads, it basically becomes 8 cores, 8 threads. Again, reducing CPU clocks, and it's doing its best to behave like an x86-based Jaguar CPU which resided in the PlayStation 4 or PS4 Pro. Spoofing a ID though, it's basically telling the game that the system has X processor rather than the Y processor which is actually inside it. This works in conjunction with the aforementioned methods of reducing clock frequency and gating off certain processor functionality, so that basically the software itself, which was of course created for the PS4, will run pretty much identical to the PS4 system. In fact, sometimes you'll get actual frame rate improvements. Because if it didn't, the game would basically panic because it has no idea what a Zen 2 processor is, and would error out because, well, there's like over 9,000 times more cache. Slight exaggeration. So if Sony wanted to do PlayStation 1, 2 or 3 support locally, and I stress the word locally because obviously they can do so via the cloud, they already have in some cases, this would mean that the code is executing on your local machine, not via the cloud then, and so they would probably employ methods of emulation. If you cast your mind back to the PlayStation 2 launch, it was actually pretty marvellous, honestly. Owners of Sony's PlayStation 2, which was the brand spanking new machine of course at that point, could plonk a copy of Resident Evil 2, which was a PS1 game, into their new console and you're good to go. Sony did this by incorporating quite literally PlayStation 1 hardware inside the PlayStation 2. The PS1's MIP R3000A was located inside the PS2, along with the GTE. This would be used actually for I/O purposes on the console, such as USB, if the PlayStation 2 was running a PlayStation 2 native game. But if a PS1 title was loaded, instead that processor would actually take over the main duties, so to say, of the running of this console, basically running the game actually, and run at 33.8 MHz for PlayStation 1 titles, instead of 37.5. Just for your references though, for completeness sake, later PlayStation 2 models replaced this with PowerPC silicon. I believe backwards compatibility was still pretty good, but I haven't done much testing myself. Earlier PlayStation 3 so-called fat models actually had similar methods here. The PlayStation 2 hardware inside the machine for backwards compatibility did exist, although it wasn't given, say, I/O duties for the PS3. This was removed in later revisions. In fact, there was kind of like a revision which incorporated hardware and software, and then basically the whole thing just got removed for later PS3 models to reduce cost because the PlayStation 3 was so damn expensive. So what about the PlayStation 5 then? Well, let's start with PlayStation 1 emulation, because at this point it could run on a cell phone. Hell, it could probably run on the box that your cell phone came in. We've had PCs supporting PlayStation 1 emulation since the late 90s, and even Sega's Dreamcast had a PlayStation 1 emulator. It was kind of weird. It was called Bleamcast, and it would be on a game-by-game basis. You could actually upsample the game's resolution with modern emulators, apply anti-aliasing, texture filtering, and all of that jazz. And again, PlayStation 1 emulation isn't just on PC at this point. It's on cell phones, it's on Raspberry Pis, it's on just about everything. With the PlayStation 2, it's pretty much the same thing. PS2 emulation on PC is really good, and if you want to mess around with it, you can actually hack the game. Well, not technically hack, but still higher visual quality, such as rendering at 4K, injecting anti-aliasing and other stuff, which just hadn't really been incorporated in the game at launch. The emulation isn't necessarily flawless. It depends on the emulator that you're using, and also the game. But in general, the emulation for PlayStation 2 titles on PC and other systems is pretty much immaculate at this stage. This is straight up emulation. The developers basically write code and essentially program this code to emulate the functionality of specific hardware blocks. On, say, the PS1, how the CPU works, how the GPU works, and then in some emulators it can even do things like overclock the CPU of the console. This is really good if consoles were quite notorious for slowing down, if you're running quite intensive games. So what about the PlayStation 3? Well, our friend and buddy, the PS3, would have to take, as you guessed it, much the same approach. Sony would need to emulate. There is no x86 processor inside the PlayStation 3, like the PS1 or PS2 actually, and instead Sony went their own route, along with IBM's, which was the cell processor. I've discussed the cell processor a lot of times at this point, but it's basically a PowerPC architecture derivative, with a single core capable of SMT, so that's one core, 2 threads, and several SPEs which can run compute based instructions, and this was all done via DMA. There's already a fully functional emulator for the PC, and this does a wonderful job of PlayStation 3 emulation. You can actually look over the requirements of the emulator. Sony could almost certainly replicate this directly on the PlayStation 5. If we look at the requirements here, basically it requires a 6-core Zen 2 based CPU, 8GB of RAM, and a GeForce GTX 900 series card or greater for its recommended. The PlayStation 5 offers way more RAM, GPU and CPU performance than what's asked for here, and that's nothing to say of the optimizations that Sony could incorporate because it's running bespoke hardware. I want to be really clear about this and simplify things as much as possible for those who are still a little confused between the emulator that I'm referring to and how the PlayStation 5 runs PS4 software. The PS4 is an x86 like the PS5, and much of the hardware is capable of basically turning off newer features to replicate PS4 architectures, such as disabling ray tracing, hardware on the GPU, disabling SMT, and so on. Essentially, the PlayStation 5 was created with the ability for the hardware itself to function pretty much identically, or at least close enough in proximity to the PS4. To run a PlayStation 1 game though, there is no PS1 hardware inside the PlayStation 5. There is no method for the hardware to emulate that. There is no functionality because there are, for example, instructions that the PlayStation 1 would use which are just not present on PS5 Silicon, just for an example. So software would quite literally need to replicate this functionality of X or Y hardware of the PS1. So if we load up the infamous PS2 emulator for PC, PCSX2, you can see how there's different options for how the emulator handles different aspects of the hardware with different plugins. So yeah, with the PlayStation 5, we could easily have a system which is capable of emulating PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PlayStation 3 probably without any issues, as well as offering a host of upgrades such as 4K outputs and so on and so on. The real crux of the matter is that the PlayStation 5 is way more powerful than the minimum specifications required for the PC iterations of emulators, which can do just that. And you have to remember that because the PlayStation 5 is bespoke hardware created by Sony, you can really optimize the emulator around that. There are a ton of rumours, of course, whether Sony will do this, but seeing the patents here, there's almost certainly no evidence that these patents pertain to PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, or PlayStation 3 backwards compatibility. It's almost certainly that all of these patents just are talking about the PS4. And when you think about it, Sony's efforts at the moment do seem to also be leaning towards the cloud as well. There have been rumours that they're going to be offering a Microsoft-like, streaming service, or at least heavily pushing it, along with a Game Pass as well. Now, whether that happens or not, I honestly don't know. Seriously, the ball at this point is in Sony's court. And the real irony, the thing that really is kind of sad, is that if you have an Xbox Series system, you can just pay a couple of bucks, really, and you can get an emulator on your console, which quite literally is capable of playing like PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 games. I don't think it can play PS3, I could be wrong on that, but you can certainly play like PS1 and PS2. But outside of this, if you do want to play PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, assuming you don't have access or you don't want to use original hardware, which, let's say, the PS1 and 2 in particular, it's not super easy to get them running on, like, a modern TV. You could use something like OSSC and upsample, but then you may need the correct cables, and also, let's just be honest, hardware isn't exactly infinite in how long it lasts. Like, lenses kind of fail, and you may also want to protect your physical media and everything else as well. So my advice will probably be instead to use something like a Raspberry Pi, and then obviously you can make backups of your own software and then run it that way. The PlayStation 3, again, you've got emulators for that on PC. We've actually looked at a Morphine PC recently, which is a mini PC. It's absolutely titchy. And that is also a pretty damn good emulation box. Really, it's kind of up to you. Unfortunately, Sony doesn't seem to want to give you a solution on the console itself, which is a damn shame, at least in my personal opinion. I hope that Sony do change their mind on this in the longer term, because obviously being able to run PlayStation 1, 2, 3, and 4 games would be absolutely amazing. I mean, going back to what I said earlier, guys, just imagine having a console capable of playing Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up. Like, just damn. It would be amazing. And I think this is one area that Microsoft, in terms of game preservation, this is not to say that the Xbox Series X, for example, is fully compatible with every single Xbox 360, and so on game, but they have done a pretty good job. And for the most part, I think this is one area that I can really give kudos to Microsoft in. Just a quick note as well about PlayStation 4. If you are a if you are a PC owner and you've got like a high-end PC, there is also a PlayStation 4 emulator, which is, it's coming on basically. The PlayStation 4 emulator for PC is called Spine, but at the moment it's not open source, so unfortunately a ton of developers can't, community can't really get around the project, but I do respect the developers' wishes here. Ultimately, they created it, they get to choose whether it's open or closed source or not, and it is closed source, so unfortunately there won't be branches of the emulator, and at the moment the developer is working diligently. Compatibility is nowhere near like 100% at the moment, so some games do work, or they'll get just to like the title screen, and others basically just don't work at all. Unfortunately, games like Bloodborne at this point don't work. I haven't tried the emulator myself. I've looked at a couple of the videos online, and there's also a compatibility list which you can check out from the emulator. And again, there are some games which obviously do work on the emulator, especially like, let's say indie games and stuff, but it's just something to keep an eye on. It'll be really interesting from the sake of game preservation, I suppose. But what's really cool, of course, is Sony are porting a lot of their titles anyway to the PC at the moment. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, well, you know what to do. Leave a likey on the video, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.